Every empire, every war, every invention that changed the shape of human life, history is not a story, it is a record, and records deserve to be kept without distortion, without agenda, without myth dressed as fact. If Kurzgesagt is for broad education, this channel is for factual history. This is the History Project, the most rigorously factual history on YouTube. If that matters to you, subscribe, support the project. Every subscriber makes it possible to keep building this archive, one verified fact at a time. On the night of August 4th, 1964, two American destroyers were cutting through the dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The radar screens were alive, the sonar was screaming. Sailors reported torpedo wakes in the water, and somewhere out there in the black, an enemy seemed to be attacking, except nothing was there. What the crew of the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy were detecting that night were echoes, ghosts on a screen, misread signals bouncing off waves and weather. Later analysis, including a National Security Agency history declassified decades afterward, would conclude that the second attack, the one that changed everything, never actually happened. There were no hostile vessels, no torpedoes, no second engagement, just technology misread by exhausted men in a tense and confusing night, and a political system that was already leaning toward a decision it had been looking for a reason to make. But in Washington, the reaction was immediate. President Lyndon Johnson ordered airstrikes on North Vietnam within hours. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution by an overwhelming margin, granting the president virtually unlimited authority to take whatever military steps he deemed necessary to defend Southeast Asia. It was one of the broadest delegations of war-making power in American history, and it rested on an incident that, in its decisive second part, did not occur. This is not a story about soldiers. The men and women who served in Vietnam were, by nearly every account, skilled, committed, and courageous. This is a story about something harder to see and slower to understand. The systems, the incentives, the decisions made in offices and boardrooms and classified briefings that shaped the war long before any particular battle began. It is a story about how a powerful nation with overwhelming resources and genuine conviction could construct the conditions of its own defeat. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what America thought it was doing and why, at almost every level, the way it measured progress made actual progress impossible. The United States did not stumble into Vietnam without warning. It arrived through a long series of careful, calculated steps, each one reasonable in isolation, each one building on the last. By 1964, America already had thousands of military advisors in South Vietnam. The Cold War framing was clear. If South Vietnam fell to communist forces, the logic went, others would follow. The domino theory was the lens through which Southeast Asia was understood in Washington, and it made intervention feel not just justified, but necessary. What the Gulf of Tonkin incident did was provide a mechanism. It turned a simmering commitment into a formal mandate, and once Congress handed Johnson that resolution, the scale of American involvement changed almost overnight. The United States moved from advising a foreign military to fighting a war of its own. The question that followed, and it was a question that would haunt the entire conflict, was, how do you know if you're winning? In a conventional war, the answer is usually obvious. You capture territory, you push the enemy back, you hold a line and advance it. Progress is visible on a map. But in Vietnam, that kind of progress was almost immediately unavailable. The enemy didn't hold territory in the conventional sense. They moved, they disappeared, they blended into the population and re-emerged somewhere else. The front line, when it existed at all, was everywhere. Into this problem walked Robert McNamara. McNamara was one of the most analytically gifted men ever to run the Pentagon. He came from the world of systems analysis, the discipline of breaking complex problems into measurable components, finding the numbers that mattered, and optimizing toward them. He'd applied this approach at Ford Motor Company with extraordinary success. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that the same rigor could be brought to warfare. The problem was the measurement itself. In a war without front lines, without territory changing hands, without any of the conventional indicators of military progress, the Pentagon needed something it could count. What it landed on was the body count, the number of enemy soldiers killed in a given operation, a given week, a given month. If the goal was to break the enemy's will by attrition, then the number of enemy dead was, at least in theory, a proxy for progress. You were winning, the logic went, if you were killing more of them than they could replace. This was the McNamara fallacy, the belief that what could be measured was what mattered, and that what couldn't be measured didn't matter at all. Political control of villages, the loyalty of the population, the enemy's willingness to absorb losses and continue fighting regardless. These things were real, they were decisive, and they couldn't be entered into a spreadsheet. What happened next followed almost inevitably from the incentives that had been created. Commanders in the field were evaluated, implicitly or explicitly, on the numbers they produced. High kill counts meant successful operations. Successful operations meant promotions, resources, approval, and so the pressure to produce high numbers became immense, and the numbers responded accordingly. After major operations, reported enemy casualties often far exceeded the number of weapons captured from the dead, a discrepancy that, when you think about it carefully, tells its own story. Civilian deaths were frequently reclassified, the categories blurred, and the further up the chain of command the data traveled, the less it resembled what had actually happened on the ground. Some officers described the mission in terms that had been stripped of everything except killing, not securing villages, not building relationships with local populations, not achieving any particular political goal, but simply accumulating enemy dead. When the metric becomes the mission loses its meaning. And meanwhile, North Vietnamese forces continued fighting. This is the part that confounds a simple reading of attrition logic. If you kill enough of the enemy, eventually they run out. But that calculation depends on the enemy having a finite willingness to absorb losses. And in Vietnam, that willingness proved to be, for all practical purposes, unlimited. North Vietnamese commanders understood they were fighting a war of endurance. They didn't need to defeat the United States militarily. They needed to outlast American political will. And every number the Pentagon produced, every body count reported back to Washington, was measuring the wrong thing. The terrain itself was a form of argument. Vietnam is a country of dense jungle, mountain ridges, river deltas, and flooded rice paddies. It is geography that rewards concealment and punishes the kind of conventional military movement that American forces were trained and equipped for. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong understood this, and they had spent decades learning how to use it. Their doctrine was built around avoiding decisive engagement. They attacked when they chose to. On ground they chose, and then dispersed before American firepower could be brought to bear. They built elaborate tunnel systems, underground networks that allowed fighters to move and shelter and emerge where they weren't expected. They relied on booby traps and mines, which could not be countered by air superiority or artillery, and which inflicted a steady, grinding toll on American soldiers. Not just in casualties, but in the psychological weight of constant uncertainty. You could not see the enemy. You could not always distinguish the fighter from the farmer. Every step in the wrong kind of terrain carried risk. American forces could win engagements. They won many of them, against significant odds, with real skill and courage. But winning an engagement and securing territory were not the same thing. A village cleared in the morning might be under different control by evening. A jungle valley swept by a search and destroy mission would be empty during the operation and reoccupied once the Americans withdrew. The nature of guerrilla warfare is precisely that it cannot be solved by superior firepower alone, because the enemy's center of gravity is not a position on a map. It is the endurance of a movement. It is the patience of a population. It is the willingness to sustain losses that would be, by any conventional military logic, catastrophic, and keep fighting anyway. Extensive bombing campaigns damaged infrastructure and supply lines, but they did not break the enemy's organizational capacity or its resolve. What they sometimes did was generate new problems, civilian casualties, destroyed villages, displaced populations, and in a war where the political loyalty of the Vietnamese people was itself a strategic objective, those effects mattered enormously. There is a concept in counterinsurgency theory. It was understood, at least partially, by military thinkers at the time, that the population is not the background of the war, but the center of it. You don't win by destroying enough of the enemy. You win by giving enough of the population a reason to prefer your side to theirs. Search and destroy operations, whatever their tactical results, often worked against this goal. They generated resentment. They confirmed narratives that the foreign power was not protecting Vietnamese civilians, but endangering them. And they fed the very insurgency they were meant to suppress. The result was a kind of strategic circularity. American forces would sweep, destroy, report success, and withdraw. The underlying conditions would reassert themselves. The next sweep would begin. The numbers would accumulate. And the war would continue, consuming resources and lives on both sides, without any clear mechanism by which it could actually end in American favor. Back in Washington, something was happening that the battlefield couldn't fix. Throughout the escalation of the war, the American public had been told a particular story. Progress was being made. The strategy was working. The enemy was weakening. Officials expressed confidence, cited the body counts, and described a war that was, if not yet won, trending in the right direction. This was the official version, delivered from podiums and press briefings and televised addresses, and for a time, enough people believed it. But inside the classified corridors of the Defense Department, a different assessment existed. Internal documents, memoranda, analyses, strategy reviews prepared for senior officials told a story that diverged sharply from the public one. They described a war that was not progressing as described. They questioned whether the strategy was working. They acknowledged doubts that were never spoken aloud in official statements. Successive administrations had privately understood things about the war's direction that they had not shared with the public, and in some cases had actively contradicted. In 1971, those documents became public. Daniel Ellsberg, a defense analyst who had worked on Vietnam policy and who had come to believe the war was both unwinnable and unjust, leaked the Pentagon Papers to the press. The documents ran in the New York Times and other newspapers, and what they revealed was not just a gap between public statements and private assessments. It was a systematic pattern of concealment, a gap between what the government knew and what it was willing to say. The effect on public trust was profound. This was not the first moment of American skepticism about the war. The Tet Offensive in 1968, in which Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including the American embassy compound in Saigon, had already shattered the official narrative of a war under control. Television had brought images of the conflict into American living rooms in ways that previous wars had not allowed. The gap between the optimistic briefings and the visible reality had been growing for years, but the Pentagon Papers made the gap official. It was no longer a matter of interpretation or disagreement about the meaning of events. Here, in classified government documents, were the internal admissions, the doubts, the acknowledged failures, the deliberate management of public perception, while privately the assessments grew darker. Americans who had trusted their government to level with them found that trust had been misplaced. Political opposition to the war, which had been building throughout the late 1960s, intensified. Congressional appetite for continuing to fund and support the conflict eroded. The question was no longer simply whether the war could be won. It was whether the institutions conducting it had been honest with the people they represented. And the answer, the document showed, was complicated in ways that were very hard to defend. What had been lost was not just public support for a particular war. What had been lost was a portion of the credibility that makes democratic governance function. And once credibility is spent, it is extraordinarily difficult to recover. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, provided the formal mechanism for American withdrawal. U.S. combat forces left Vietnam. Military aid continued for a time, but at levels that diminished as congressional support for the effort declined. The South Vietnamese military, which had been built around American firepower, American logistics, and American funding, now had to sustain itself without those foundations. What followed illuminated something important about the entire enterprise. South Vietnam's government and military had been supported for years by an external power that was, in the most literal sense, holding the structure together. That support had provided resources, technology, air cover, and financial stability. It had also, in ways that were harder to see at the time, substituted for the internal coherence that a functioning state needs to survive independently. The South Vietnamese government faced serious problems of corruption and declining morale. It had not developed the internal legitimacy, the genuine popular mandate that might have allowed it to withstand the withdrawal of foreign support. The system had been optimized to function with American backing, and when that backing disappeared, the optimization no longer worked. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched a conventional military offensive. This was not guerrilla warfare. It was tanks and artillery and massed formations, the kind of force projection that the United States had spent years trying to prevent. The South Vietnamese military, under-resourced and poorly positioned, began to collapse. Units retreated, cities fell. The speed of the collapse surprised even those who had predicted the war would eventually end this way. By April 1975, North Vietnamese forces were at the gates of Saigon. American personnel and thousands of Vietnamese refugees were evacuated by helicopter from rooftops across the city, in scenes that were broadcast around the world. On April 30th, 1975, the last helicopters lifted off. Saigon fell. The war was over. What had just happened? The tempting answer is the simplest one. America lost because it fought poorly, or because politicians tied the military's hands, or because the public lost its nerve. These explanations are comforting in a way because they locate the failure in something correctable. Fight harder next time. Trust the generals. Hold firm. But the evidence of the war itself points somewhere else entirely. The failure was systemic. It was present in the way the war began, in the willingness to treat an ambiguous radar reading as a casus belli, to allow political momentum to override careful analysis, to build a massive commitment on a foundation that crumbled almost immediately under scrutiny. It was present in the way the war was measured, in the substitution of body counts for strategy, in the incentive structures that rewarded the production of favorable numbers rather than the achievement of actual objectives, in the fundamental category error of applying industrial optimization logic to a political and social conflict. It was present in the terrain and the adversary, in the failure to develop an approach that could address the actual nature of the insurgency rather than the conventional war the American military was prepared to fight. It was present in the credibility gap, in the long accumulation of misleading statements that eventually collapsed public trust in a way that no military victory could have rebuilt. And it was present in the structure of South Vietnam itself, in the inability to build a state capable of sustaining itself without indefinite external support. Each of these failures was, in a sense, understandable. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was confusing. McNamara genuinely believed in the power of data. American commanders were fighting with the doctrine and equipment they had. Officials genuinely believed, at various moments, that they were making progress. The problem was not that the people involved were uniquely foolish or corrupt. The problem was that the systems they were operating within consistently produced bad information, bad incentives, and bad decisions, and that by the time any individual actor recognized the problem, the momentum of those systems was almost impossible to reverse. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of the Vietnam War, and the one that is most easily missed. It is not a lesson about heroism or betrayal or the cost of idealism. It is a lesson about what happens when the way you measure success is not aligned with what success actually requires. When feedback loops are broken, when the information reaching decision makers is systematically distorted, when the metrics being optimized bear no relationship to the outcomes that matter. Even capable, well-resourced institutions can pursue failure with remarkable efficiency. The Gulf of Tonkin gave a mandate, the body count gave a purpose, the jungle gave resistance, the credibility gap gave a reckoning, and the fall of Saigon gave a conclusion that had been, in the logic of the preceding decades, almost inevitable. The United States did not lose the Vietnam War on any particular battlefield. It lost it in the accumulation of decisions made before the first major battles began, in the structures built to prosecute a war that couldn't be won by the means chosen to fight it, in the slow erosion of the alignment between what was being done and what actually needed to happen. Understanding that is not an act of blame, it is an act of precision, the same precision that was missing when it mattered most.